Today starts the beginning of social psychology, one of our most interesting ones, and that's why classroom activities are really cool to do with this one. There's so many interesting topics. Um, when we first think about social psychology, I want in all the things that you've read about in the textbook, I want you to first think about what is your first impression when you see the picture of this person. Now, some of you might be laughing because you may know who that is. And then we find out that as possibly attractive, depending on if you think he is attractive, the character is actually from the show You, and he's actually a killer because he's obsessed with the girl he wants for himself. And then you compare it to somebody like this. And you look at him, and what you don't know about him is he's a homeless man who's a veteran and a war hero, and currently has PTSD and has a mental illness, which is one of the reasons why he's homeless because of the Vietnam War. And we all have these sort of impressions in our head, social categorizations, attitudes and prejudice about people. And all of that is really interesting to look at. And then as we kind of categorize like how we have attitudes with people and how our thought processes sort of work and how our schemas are developed in our mores and our folkways and all that, we start to get into why things are prejudice and discrimination. And then we start thinking about how social environments interact and affect us and why we conform and so forth. And so it's really an interesting topic to look at. In the beginning of the book, it talked about Fern, who dropped the quarters in the man's cup, and he gets really upset because she has this sort of attitude about who this person is, and it looks like somebody who's homeless, and she makes a lot of mistakes, and we will tend to do that because we compartmentalize and create these schemas in our mind about who somebody is based on the environment, how we feel, how they look, all those kinds of things, and sometimes those are wrong, and that's what she discovered. Social psychology investigates how your thoughts and feelings are influenced by the presence of other people. It is sociology, but in sociology, it's the interaction of groups. So this is really the individual within the environment and how that works. Social settings can be alone with others or in front of a crowd in terms of that environment. And our concept of or sense of self is really involved. Your social being has been shaped by the interactions you have in that social group, and this includes, of course, culture. Plays a key role in how you perceive and react to others. So it's one of the reasons why we do what we do and we have the behaviors and thoughts that we do. So that's why it's important to study. And social behaviors are displayed universally. We found that in diverse cultures, we see those common social behaviors within any kind of culture. And so it's thought to be human evolutionary processes by psychologists. All right, the two areas of study we can talk about is social cognition, how we form impressions of other people and how we interpret the meaning of other people's behavior and how that affects our attitudes. And then social influence, how our behavior is affected by other people and by social or situational factors. So maybe why we conform to group norms, even though we may not agree with them or we don't want to do those behaviors, why we obey authority figures. Those two in particular are going to be addressed in the last section. When we would help a stranger and when we wouldn't, and what leads us to intentionally harming others, either physically, emotionally, or even socially, especially on social media. So what is a list of violations of social norms that show expectation of social behaviors? If we look at examples of how we break norms in our society, it would be things like cheating on a test, smoking in a non-smoking area, right now not wearing a mask in certain areas, talking on a cell phone in church or a classroom, greeting a teacher with a hug on the first day, borrowing a brush from a stranger, asking them that, cutting in line, picking your nose in public, eating food off of a stranger's plate, burping in public or passing gas, wearing jeans or workout clothes to certain areas, not giving a birthday gift to a friend when they gave you one. So that's the norm of reciprocity. When we look at those social norms, and they're also folkways, there are definitely rules and expectations in society. How do others react when someone's behavior is inappropriate? Like the person above me, that's probably sort of a particular reaction depending on what it is. There's definitely a negativity towards somebody that displays some other thing than a social norm. The difference between a norm or social norms, there's two types. There's folkways and there's mores. Folkways are more things like eating off a person's plate, or passing gas in public. You're not going to go to jail. You're not breaking a law in that instance. Mores are violent. They get more severe punishment. So rape, robbery, somebody taking food off of somebody's plate could be considered stealing, I guess. So somebody might press charges on that, but definitely a burp in public is more of a folkway. So one of the things that you're going to do is, unless you've done this in class, is to pause the video, and I want you to read the norm violations and identify the norm being violated on handout 12.1. So generate an example of a norm that would be easy to violate and one that would be hard also, and that's one of the things that we'll do in class. So examples, normally we give gifts or money to complete strangers. Paying for a stranger's coffee at Starbucks, especially if a person forgot their wallet, is a pro-social act. It doesn't call a lot of attention to you, and it either can be justified, versus cutting one's toenails in a restaurant would not be easy because you'd be violating a restaurant code and so forth. So an example of a norm that would be easy to violate and one that would be hard to violate. Those would be examples of that. So you'd want to think of those. Well, go ahead and look at the handout 12.1. Okay, and then person perception is the mental process that we use to judge others and draw conclusions about people, which is kind of what we were looking at the first pictures of the guy from You and also the homeless veteran. It's an active and subjective process. Obviously, your own judgments are subjective, and it always occurs in some kind of interpersonal contact, the interaction between you and other people. So here's a question. If all you knew about a person was his or her gender, age, and marital status, what judgment would you make about this person? So this was something that was done in a study. Nancy Stacy and Charles Richmond of Wake Forest, North Carolina, they got 56 males and 56 females, college students, and they had them read one of 8 scenarios about a stimulus person who was the subject of sort of the evaluation. So the person was either 19 or 25, they were either male or female, and they were dating or married. The participants answered 20 questions about that person that they were given. So it might have been a male 19-year-old that's dating. Okay, and so they're given some questions about that person to rate the person on career, educational goals, happiness in their relationship, whether they're social, maturity, were they independent, intelligent, and what social class they thought they were in. And they operationally defined the rating of those persons on a scale, a 7-point scale, so 1 to 7, from not very to very, so not very sociable or very sociable. When they did this, the results were that dating couples were rated more intelligent than married couples, which was interesting. But again, these are college students, right? So think about that. 19-year-old married persons had fewer career or educational aspirations and weaker relationships, possibly because they're younger, less sociable, less mature and independent, and had a lower social class than the dating 19-year-olds. Okay, so think a 19-year-old married person as opposed to a dating 19-year-old person. Why is it that there's such a difference? So media, okay, when's it appropriate to get married? If you're 19 and you're getting married, did somebody get pregnant? Like, what's going on? 16 and pregnant is really perpetuated, that early, baby coming in out of wedlock. Increase in marriage age for sure. Most people are getting married much later, so somebody at 19 being married could be seen as more negative and done it for some other reason. And the assumption that individuals in their early 20s should be working on education and career goals is really something that could change their perception. So what principle of personal perception do you think would determine your behaviors? Okay, as we look at this beautiful woman on the right here, there's three components that we could kind of think about. The characteristics of the person who you're making a decision about, your own characteristics, and then the situation in which you see this person. So think of how we use this to evaluate a complete stranger. You know, this woman that we see, you know, what would be one of the three components that you think you would judge first. And of course, you don't have a context in which you see her, but you do have some things. You have some cues. You have some jewelry and some hair and some clothing and things like that. So again, that visual is a lot of what we do, but also if that person was actually moving and talking in front of us, we might have a situation in which to use that too. So think about how you sort of evaluate a complete stranger. When we look at the four principles that guide person perception, all four determine your behavior, but they interact all together. The physical perception is our reactions to others determined by our own perception, not by who they really are. So remember that it's very subjective. We don't know them. We're just making up sort of these reactions based on what we think they are, not who they really are. So example, who would you sit next to on the bus? Okay, a person who looks clean, a person who looks pleasant, an older or a younger person, a person of color or who's white, or one that's attractive or unattractive to you. If you were to take the man and the two men at the beginning of the presentation, which one would you sit next to? And it's possible, not knowing anything about the guy from You being a killer, it's possible if you think about it, to be really real to yourself, like who would you feel more comfortable and safe next to? And that decision could, vary between all of us and so forth. Some of us may pick the young, attractive guy who you think could defend you on the bus, not knowing that he's actually a killer. And then you have this homeless man who is, very valiant and courageous, who could also do the same thing, but he's older. Maybe you think he is homeless and he could be dangerous or mentally ill, and he's acting different. So it all depends on how we feel about that situation. And it's really evaluating people about how we think they are, not who they really are. The second principle is self-perception. It influences how you perceive others and yourself and how you act on your perceptions. So if you think you're scary looking, you won't sit next to a small child. If you think you have body odor, you won't sit next to the person that you find attractive. You don't want them to judge you. If you think you're intelligent, you might strike up a conversation with a person you think who also looks intelligent because of the way you perceive yourself. And then your goals it determines the amount and kinds of information that you want to collect from others and so forth. So if you feel like talking to others, maybe you won't tell your story about getting to the airport when you will, then you'll sit next to others and especially choose people who are already talking. If you want to be left alone, then you might sit somewhere quiet or sit somewhere who's next to somebody who's wearing earbuds and so forth. And depends on your goal, like sort of how you, what decisions and behaviors you do. And then social norms. Look at that guy there. Wow. Perceives people on how they are expected to act and so forth. So that's obviously not acceptable behavior on a subway or a bus, because it just impedes on other people's space. And so if there's room on the bus, you'll not sit directly next to somebody. Personal space is a big thing in the United States, individualistic culture. So it almost becomes uncomfortable. You're like, why would somebody sit next to me? There's this whole bus, there. If there's an elderly woman, you would allow her to sit down first, and especially if you're a man. And if you need to make a casual call, you would not ask a person in the bus to use their cell phone. That's just not, if it's an emergency, maybe, but not a casual call. So there's all kinds of things that guide our behavior and our perception of what to do in certain situations. Okay, how does social media affect our perceptions? What part of Snapchat and Instagram do we draw conclusions about others or on ourselves? This is so huge today. We definitely look at the number of likes, the number of friends that people have. If they have a certain number of friends, they might be considered to be more socially attractive, and someone that has friends in the real world. It basically though stops at about 300 friends as research has shown, and beyond that the person's just trying to fill friend space. which I think is funny because I have like 600 Facebook friends, but I'm not trying to fill space. I legitimately, between all the places I've lived in the country, I legitimately know a lot of people. I may not talk to them all, but maybe that's kind of a thing. Like, do you hold on to all those other people you don't really have, converse with that much, and so forth. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. But they thought maybe, about 300 people thought they were, filling space. Friends that are attractive make the owner more attractive. So the friends, the type of friends that somebody has, the more attractive they are, that could make them think that the owner of the Snapchat account is really attractive as well. First impressions are usually incorrect, and color, kind of shade our perception of that person. That's called the halo effect. And, and this is a big one when we look at social media and the effects it has mentally on, especially teenagers, and even adults as well. That we always look at this, we see this person on social media and their life looks just so fantastic. And it sort of colors, it's the halo effect, the halo effect, about, kind of shading over what's actually reality. And so it's kind of interesting that we kind of use social media all the time, and some of us may know that that's the reality, but we still get kind of caught up in that halo effect. Difficulty to change and notice new information. So even if you have your first impression and it keeps continuing to be reinforced, and there's some kind of change in information, it's really hard to notice that because you've got this initial impression that's been sort of reinforced. So that's really difficult to see. And long-term relationships with others will change perceptions to more accurate evaluation. So the more time you spend being around somebody and being on their social media account, you'll see that perception start to change. But it does take time. Okay, social categorization is something that we all do. It's what I was sort of establishing at the very beginning of this, for looking at the two men. It's the mental process of classifying people based on common characteristics, okay? This is very natural, it's very adaptive, it's very evolutionary because we needed to have a quick judgment about like survival and safety, and it's a very efficient cognitive process, thinking process based on information that we have. So we first of all look at explicit cognition. So observable features. It's deliberate, it's conscious mental processes involved in judgment that affects our reasoning and our behavior. We look at gender, age, clothing, which can lead to what we think their role is, and so forth. Example, if we look at this woman, okay, this woman who's to the right here, she's a woman in workout clothes. I should say workout clothes, not working clothes, at Starbucks, and she's there at Starbucks at 11:15 in the afternoon. What type of person do you think she might be? Like first impressions, workout clothes, Starbucks at 1:15, has her purse, and she's getting her coffee. Well, if we think about that, maybe stay-at-home mom, okay? Stay-at-home mom's getting a coffee. She doesn't have any kids around her. Maybe they're at school. She's just come out from the gym and so forth. Rather than who she really is, what you don't know is that she's a physical therapist, okay, who works for a major NFL team and is working on her doctorate on the effects of exercise on the human brain. So she's in those clothing because she is a physical therapist and so forth. But because she's at Starbucks at 1:15, we may have some impression. So we take what she looks like and her gender, maybe even, and then also the situation that she's in, and we kind of make this perception, explicit cognition judgment on her. So what perception would change if she were seen as attractive versus unattractive? Think about that as well. And then we have implicit cognition and autonomic social categorization. So mental processes are associated with a non-conscious social evaluation, and these are based on prior experiences and beliefs about certain social categorizations. So things like ethnicity, weight, sexual orientation or religious beliefs, and so forth. And these are our evolutionary instincts that we sort of kick in again for that survival thing, but also they can create some issues when we are implicitly using cognition, which we do unconsciously again. We don't even sort of recognize that's what we're doing. When we look at a person like the woman in the last slide, we know we're looking at clothing, we're evaluating, we consciously are doing that. However, we may not consciously even think about her ethnicity, or her weight, and so forth, and that just might be innately kind of in that categorization. So that's why it's implicit. So attractiveness with facial features. There's a study on babies who look more at attractive faces at a week old. And again, these could be negative or positive reactions that we have based on the implicit cognition. So this develops in the implicit personality theory. This is very important. This is a big explicit and implicit cognition and implicit personality theory. These are really important concepts. There's a lot of important concepts that could be on FRQs for the AP exam. This might be one of them. This theory assumes that certain types of people share certain traits and behaviors. So the specific pattern and biases an individual uses when forming the impressions is based on a limited amount of initial information about an unfamiliar person. But we kind of look at, the schemas. We develop those schemas of what categories there are, like all the certain animals we talked about when we talked about thinking and intelligence. All types of mammals are in this category. Well, we do the same thing with people. The people with this type of personality or certain traits are going to be in that schema, okay? And we mentally framework those people and associate different people. We use our schemas to sort of figure out what's going on. Physical appearance cues are the other thing. It creates a perception. It's actually more a part of implicit theory reinforced by messages and media and so forth. So Disney has, for instance, beautiful princesses and ugly villains. So attractive type people tend to be more desirable characteristics. And so we sort of, because of the media and culture we're in, we tend to have a certain type of trait or perception of that person based on their physical cues. Now, attraction's a really interesting part of implicit personality because they've done so many studies over the years on it, and these are the more newer ones. And they did research on that, and attractive people are perceived to be more intelligent, happier, and better adjusted than others, as perceived, not because people know them. Judith Langos, she did a study where people attributed a wide range of positive qualities to attractive people, one being emotionally stable and more positive as well. And then there was a study done by Lorenzo, who they were also perceived more accurate. So people paid more attention to their traits. Don't judge a book by its cover. And they were perceived to be more accurate as well because they were attractive. Our people are happier, smarter, and more successful if in terms of attractiveness. So another one was done and it got data from 4 different countries. More attractive people are more happier due to a better economic outcome. So they usually get higher salaries and more successful spouses who also have higher salaries as well. And they did do a lot of studies on this about, will attractive people get jobs better, more than others? And there is some validity to that, but not always is that the case. Studies definitely said that people who are more considered to be more attractive have higher self-esteem and intelligence and other desirable traits. People receive more favorable treatment and the most positive emotional responses that they invoked from others. So lots of studies on that in terms of attractiveness. Does the attractiveness or unattractive of male students or female produce the same effect on personal perception then? Well, the study that was done in East Carolina, North Carolina at ECU studied the influence of certain personality traits then on academic performance. And they asked males and females to view 120 photos taken from yearbooks and magazines. And they used 4 photos from a pilot study, which was, they did this first study to find out who thought that did the ratings. So this pilot study established what the 4 photos would be, the highest and the lowest attractive ratings from those. And then they took that one and then put it with this new this new study. So participants that they had were 144 undergraduate students, 81 women and 63 men, with an average age of 22. And they told the study was how They were told that the study was how accurately they could predict certain academic variables on the certain photos and people. And they completed an adjective list evaluating the influence of ability, effort, the course difficulty, and luck on the stimulus person being the photo they saw. Luck on the stimulus person's performance, and then rated then their physical attractiveness. So they had a lot of, components in there that sort of shaded maybe what the entire study would be about. And so the result was attractive people were perceived to be average on performance, intelligence, and ability, but more academic achievement related traits and greater initiative was related to them, which was kind of interesting. So it kind of, downplayed a little bit of what we had talked about earlier. And then unattractiveness and gender were more important in the ratings, and so forth. Unattractive men were more favorable than unattractive women, though, in the workplace and academic settings. So again, that sort of that gender difference between males and females. And when we see that, I was asked, what experiences do you see with students and job applicants? What have you seen in the workplace in terms of gender? And attractiveness is such a subjective thing. So we'd have to sort of figure out, like, what is it that's attractive? And again, when we have, different genders, transgender, when we have, people who are attracted to the opposite sex, it's very difficult to sort of have the conversation about attractiveness. But I think generally people can sort of figure out, what that actually is. But again, it's such a subjective thing. It's kind of interesting when you think about these studies, how valid they actually are. Brain-based reasons for greater social success of beautiful people. So CAMP did a study in 2001 where they did an MRI study. Participants looked at colored photos of different faces, and some faces looked directly at the viewer, so they made sort of this eye contact, and some were glancing away, so non-eye contact photos. And then after the scan, they asked to rate the attractiveness of the faces. And again, we have some brain parts involved in this section. Direct eye contact with an attractive person made the ventral striatum, which you can see is the purple part, sort of in the limbic system around where the dopamine regions of the brain are. And it became very active, and it decreased if the gazes were shifted away. So it really was keyed in on that eye contact. The neutral activity occurred when the unexpected rewards like food or water is presented, and decreased when an expected reward fails. So the attractive eye contact face definitely had an impact, unlike some of the other things they were looking at. And that kind of goes along with the idea that babies look at attractive faces too. We sort of evolutionary are sort of, remember that developmental stage, like we are in tune with faces for sure. If someone sees an attractive person and can't make eye contact, like the person's too cute, then the activity decreases and that person feels disappointment. And that really goes well with that ventral striatum, because that's the reward center. So when they don't get that lit up, they do feel disappointed. It's not a reward. So that's really interesting. Other studies looked at a facial attractiveness and selected responses to a reward value of attractive faces. So what they found was the orbital frontal cortex, right in here, which we talked about with personality, is in the frontal cortex. That was an area that lit up. Nucleus accumbens, which is just it's sort of near the ventral striatum, right in there is the reward center of the brain. That also lit up, and then emotionally, like the amygdala as well. So the result was that attractive faces were involved in the same areas that processed any type of pleasurable stimulus, but they definitely were stronger. It does affect our perception, decision making, and reward circuits when we look at attractive faces. And social advantages are associated with facial attractiveness are reinforced by that reward processes in the brain. So you can imagine, like, that can also be a reward as well, and that makes it even harder to not want that reward. Which is why we perceived attractive traits the way we do. We feel that way. And I think that generally people can think about attractiveness in some way. And then, of course, we believe that people are more attractive than other people believe other people are attractive. And so it creates this reward system that's sort of perception-wise, that's a little bit different that person to person. And you can see that because it's brain and neuroscience related. Okay, another important section of this section is attribution. And attribution, I know, has been a word used on the FRQ. So all of the theories of attribution are really important to review, and those would be your subcomponents. So you talk about attribution in general, which is the process of explaining your own behavior and the behavior of other people. What can I attribute my action to? Okay, this is can cause cognitive bias and so forth, but you know, it explains our behavior. So that's how you talk about it in terms of an FRQ, but then you would use different examples of these theories. Okay, so for instance, the fundamental attribution error. So this is spontaneously attributing behavior of others to internal personal characteristics, and you ignore or underestimate the role of any external factor. We know less about other people, so you know, we tend to can have some, you know, cognitive biases depending on who you think the person is. You know, you might think that it's a personal or internal thing, but it may not be. So this one really is that personal. We think it's that, you know, internal personal characteristic, even though there might be some kind of situational factor. And then we have the actor-observer bias, and we attribute our own behavior to external situation characteristics while ignoring or underestimating the effects of internal. So blaming others or blaming the environment that we're around instead of it being about us. We know more about our behavior. We're more aware of how your behavior influences this situation. So with this one, we tend to use rationalization or, you know, kind of displacement. We like make excuses for our own behavior, and we think it's the environment that's done it. Okay, blaming the victim. We our innocent victims somehow causes the situation because people want to believe the world is fair. A good example of this is Pamela Smart, who was kidnapped out of her bedroom, and people constantly were talking about how she could have escaped and why didn't she escape. And they don't want to think that it's, if you are kidnapped, that you could possibly be held for as many years as she was. And so this is called the just world hypothesis, or sort of hindsight biases. Explains that the victim should have known and then it deserves its fate. So a lot of times this happens with battered women as well. You know, why don't women in abusive relationships and marriages, why don't they just leave? And I've worked with those women, and it's very difficult. They're very scared and so forth. So blaming the victim does happen, and it doesn't sound like it would be right, but people do it automatically. And they do it in all kinds of different situations. It doesn't have to be things like kidnapping and abuse. It can be blaming somebody, you know, for any kind of situation. And then hindsight bias is overestimating one's ability to have foreseen or to predict the outcome of an event. I could have told you this was going to happen. So in this one, like the victim should have known that somebody could get into her room and kidnap her. Why didn't she do that? So that can be added onto blaming the victim. Self-serving bias is attributing successful outcomes to one's own behavior. Internal causes and unsuccessful outcomes to the external cause. So students on a test would say, like, they studied hard versus the teacher gave them tricky questions and so forth. And it protects self-esteem, especially more in those individualistic cultures. It really, that self-serving bias, if something happens and you're like, oh yeah, it's because I spent a lot of time working. Self-effacing bias is blaming ourselves for our failures due to internal causes and downplaying the success by the external. By blaming successes on the external or situational is more of a collectivistic cultural thing. So it isolates us all from that uncomfortable thought in general. So attributions are really important to go over. In terms of collectivistic versus individualistic attributions, Marcus and Takayama, they did a study with individualist and cultivistic societies. So in terms of cultivistic, they attribute academic success to situational factors, which makes sense because it's not about the individual, it's about the collection and the society. So, so they would say like the test was easy. Self-esteem is not based on doing better than others, and standing out causes discomfort and tension. They're less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error. They would recognize the role of external factors instead of internal. Now, when it comes to other studies that have been done by Morris and Pang, they compared articles reporting the same mass murder in Chinese language and in English. Murderers were Chinese graduate students and a postal worker. The reporters from America attributed killing to the internal bad temper, mental instability. So really that fundamental attribution error was about the internal person. The Chinese reporters attributed the killing to social pressure and problems in society, so more of the external factors. So you can really see that fundamental attribution error there. So one of the activities you're going to do is match the type of person, perception, or attribution concept that explains its scenario. And I have that on a handout that you're going to do. So if you are doing this virtually, then you're going to take that. I have copies of the attribution notes, and then you're going to take and do this 5 little questions, and it has 5 different things up top that you can use to put A, B, C, D, or E. So if you pause the video, do that activity, and then come back, and I will give you the answers. Okay, here we go. Here are the answers. A is self-effacing bias. 2 is social categorization. The third one is implicit personality theory. 4 is self-serving bias. And 5 is fundamental attribution error. Hopefully you did well on those. If not, go back and review those notes and see if you can figure out, and ask me any questions about those if you have any questions. Okay, so in terms of attitudes, attitudes are also in this section. Learning tendencies to evaluate some object, person, or issue in a particular way, either positive or negative or sort of ambivalent, which is mixed feelings about it. And there's 3 components to attitude. Cognition is your thoughts and concerns about a given topic. So Emil is an art lover, so his opinion in visiting art museums makes him more calmer. An example, my daughter Olivia believes that she should be able to eat Takis every day. And so she ends up getting very passionate about Takis. At least she was a year ago. And then number 2 component is affective or emotional. So how excited or passionate, positive or negative. So it could be negative emotion, positive emotion a person is about a topic. So again, Emil is excited about seeing a certain art exhibit. My daughter Olivia is almost in tears when she gets Takis. True statement. And then third is your behavioral. Your attitudes are reflected in your actions. So again, Emil visits museums because he's an art lover. It makes him calmer, and he is excited about seeing them. So he regularly does that and donates to organizations that introduce art to younger children. And something that my daughter does when we drive by a Rickers or Get-Go, she asks to get Takis all the time because she wants them. She thinks she should be able to eat them every day and has this positive emotion about Takis. So it can affect their behavior. So attitudes about people, interpersonal attraction and liking. So attraction, again, is referring to the feeling that you're drawn to somebody else, having positive thoughts or feelings about them and wanting to establish a relationship with them. So what makes one person more attractive than another to us? So physical appearance, especially facial features, both men and women cross-culturally believe this, might be a sign of health, which is desirable in a mate, to have health. But physical appearance in cross-cultural studies, they found that wide smiles, high eyebrows, dilated pupils, and full lips tend to be more seen as attractive. So as we talked about before, what is attractive, what isn't attractive, there are some common things that psychologists have found. But again, that's going to be different for everybody as well. Okay, character traits or behavior. So are they warm? Are they trustworthy? Are they adventurous? It depends. And that's where some of the physical features kind of melt away, and then we have more of the physical traits. And then social status also, psychologists have found, is something that creates attractiveness. Some gender differences, women prefer taller men and men prefer short or average height women. And that was kind of interesting too. Aspects of attraction, similarity. More attractive to people who are perceived to be more like us. Physical characteristics, personality traits, attitudes, health. If one person is an avid exerciser and one isn't, that's not as similar, and that may eventually create some kind of issues. Younger children find others who share views on books, homework, pets to be more attractive, and so forth. And similarity, though, is less attractive in Eastern cultures. It's more in Western cultures, but it is consistent, just less in Eastern cultures. Familiarity is the other one. The more interaction with a person, the more we tend to like that person. The most interactions are pleasant, or else why would they be another of them. Frequent interactions leads to more pleasurable things and acceptance. I don't know if any of you know the couple above my head. They were on Bachelor in Paradise, but Evan, he really liked Carly and Carly did not like him. But being together on that island over and over and spending more time together, she really developed very strong feelings, and they actually were one of the couples to get married, and they have kids now, and they're still together and very, very happy. So that would be an example of familiarity. No, you think about the importance of this in terms of getting to know somebody. In terms of like us having relationships with people, before you pass judgments and decide who somebody is and if you are attracted or not, is getting to know them and the importance of that long-term attractiveness, and that can actually happen. It also affects attraction. If we feel that others will be attracted to us, then we're more likely to be attracted to them. And that kind of happens, like somebody likes you and you're like, I don't, or you like them and then they don't like you and then you don't find them as attractive. But once you find out that they do like you, then they become even more attractive, and you act really positively around them, which then just ensues that and reinforces it. And then socioeconomic and cultural environments. This is really interesting too, that men, some of the studies they've done is men prefer heavier women when resources and food is scarce, and thinner women when resources are abundant. And, the idea is that the heavier women obviously have been able to find some kind of resources when they are scarce. A study done by Nelson and Morrison compared the preferences of college students as they entered and left the dining hall. I love this one. Hungry males entering preferred heavier women, and versus the satiated men, the men that had been eating, they were exiting. So only males, not females, but the hungry men preferred the heavier woman versus the men that actually had eaten. Body shape preferences are affected by culture, but also are due to situational influences, which when there's food scarcity, that would be an example. Other studies, heavy or thin, men preferred women with a waist that's a good deal smaller than her hips. That was a universal attraction. Even blind men touched mannequins, and they believed that those women or mannequins with a smaller waist were more attractive. Body proportions predicted a lower risk of disease and better reproduction, because weight can affect reproduction, and so forth, and success for genes to be passed on. Evolutionary perspective really is represented here, sort of this idea of survival, of, genetics, having somebody pass along genes and so forth. You can really see that here. And then we have, lastly, with attitudes, this one's really important. This is cognitive dissonance. This particular one I have seen several times on an FRQ, so make sure you pay attention to it. And it can be evaluated with somebody in a FRQ situation. And this is the unpleasant state of tension that occurs when there's an inconsistency between two thoughts or perceptions. So, for instance, the little girl at the top there, liars are bad people. That is one thought or perception. But then she does something, but I just lied, and she has that attitude or so forth. And then the man there, you shouldn't be stealing those office supplies. What's the big deal? You deserve to get a few privileges sometimes. So those are two, it's a conflict between two attitudes that someone has. And it can create some interesting things about attitude. The state of dissonance is so unpleasant that you are strongly motivated to try to reduce it. And that's where you see your devil and your angel, your Freudian id and superego. They are going to use some defense mechanisms to try to get rid of that and reduce that unpleasant dissonance. You're more apparent when it's more apparent when your behavior and attitudes conflict, in turn holding two conflicting cognitions. You have your original attitude, liars are bad people, and then the realization that your behavior contradicts that attitude. So it's not the behavior that's the second thing, it's the realization that you have just contradicted that first attitude. So the original attitude, liars are bad people, then you lie to somebody, and then the realization that you lied and that it contradicts that original attitude, those two are what's the cognitive dissonance comparing. When behavior can't be justified, difficult to resolve the uncomfortable feelings if we can't find something to rationalize with it. Because you can't change your behavior, you change your attitude. So because the little girl lied, she can't take back that she lied, so she just changes her attitude. Kind of a little bit of a defense mechanism too, when you change your attitude. And it depends on, you are going to use defense mechanisms to do that. And then if you change your attitude, then that becomes more consistent with your behavior, and it changes. Changing attitude can occur quickly, even though without us even knowing it, because we've changed our attitude. So for instance, somebody offers you a grasshopper, and in our social norms, like, we don't really eat grasshoppers and so forth. And so after you do eat it, you say, eating those grasshoppers are not that bad. Before it was disgusting. Then you eat one, and then you want to sort of rationalize that, it's so inconsistent. You're like, I would never eat a grasshopper. And then you eat one because you're in another country, and then you have to sort of go, well, no, eating them is not that bad, because there were two different attitudes and your behavior didn't represent that original, okay? And we do things like sour grape rationalization and sweet lemon rationalization, which I'll talk about in a second. And some interesting things that they've looked at with brain scans is part of the brain associated with stress, arousal, emotion, and conflict change when a person had to make a difficult decision. And so it indicates that the discomfort was definitely produced by the change. So a study was done that showed that not just adults go through this cognitive dissonance, but also children do. When they were forced to choose something that they thought was equally fine, the stickers, the 4-year-olds that had to choose the stickers, and they thought that both, a dolphin and I forget what it was, a dolphin or a dinosaur are equal, and they were like, I don't know. But if they were forced to choose, that created some stress, and they could see that light up. And then the monkeys that they did them also had to choose different colored M&Ms that they thought were equal. Then when the monkey preferred the chosen color. So once they chose, let's say, red, then they really preferred red. It really changed their attitude because they were trying to get rid of that discomfort. And by getting rid of the discomfort, they just said, okay, well, yeah, I like red better, because that's what they chose. Even though equally they were looking at them equally before, it caused distress by forcing them to have to choose, and then they changed their attitude by then always choosing the one that they originally chose. Like, if they didn't think blue and red was very different, or let's say like orange and yellow, because they're sort of similar color, and they're like, I don't know, and then they chose yellow. Well, because they chose yellow, it was sort of this like distress between the two. And so by choosing yellow all the time now, they don't have that distress anymore. So it really, like, cognitive dissonance can change our attitudes and our decisions. And when you make a choice, you emphasize the negative features of the choice you didn't. So that's sour grapes. And then when you choose something, you then put forth the positive features of the choice that you did choose. So if you're trying to choose between, two different things, and you choose one, the positive features you put on that would be like the more positive rationalization, okay? Interesting thing that I found about cognitive dissonances in terms of making a change and like having some societal impact on that is youth violence and guns. And so based on the theory, we can change attitudes than behaviors. Violence-prone attitudes are likely to be motivated to learn nonviolent conflict management. One of the studies that was done, researchers developed a attitude towards gun and violent questionnaire, and it tested 4 attitude components of attraction to guns and violence. And so the things that came out of that were excitement, so they were intrinsically stimulated by guns. Power and safety, the use of them would provide these. A comfort with aggression, and so that sort of social norm in those gun-prone societal places in a use world. And then aggressive response to shame. So they were hypersensitive to disrespect from other people, and assaulting the other person would reduce that shame and undo the damage to their self-confidence. So that was one thing that was given. And then the questionnaire was shown to predict gun ownership. It was a marker for serious, violent, and correlation with aggression and hostility and so forth. And why this is powerful, because gun violence is something that's real in a lot of communities. And so what they did was they recommended interventions then for violent youths. And they said, well, analyze and affirm the youth's need for excitement and power and safety and pride. That's their attitude towards it. And then question the effectiveness of violence to meet those needs, and then provide more non-violent strategies to achieve those excitement, power, safety, and pride goals. And really they said, you know, this theory is about you need to change the attitudes before you change the behavior. And that's really powerful when you look at working with youth and also with kids. You know, attitudes hold a lot of weight. So example of this would be the Peacemaker program, and it uses this strategy, and 41% they had when they used this strategy was a decrease in aggression-related disciplinary issues. And then there was a 67 decrease in suspensions. So when they really focused in on the attitude versus the behavior itself, it really made quite a difference. All right, hope you enjoyed this section. We'll see you later.